Hi, I'm Claire Testoni, and I host a podcast called Singing Bones. Singing Bones is a podcast that looks at the origin of fairy tales, the bare bones of stories. Follow your favourite tales from their beginnings, discover new tales you've never heard, and rediscover stories you thought you knew. Looking at history, literature, and popular culture, we look at fairy tales in a whole new way, a way that is not for children, and certainly not Disney. You can find us on iTunes or at singingbonespodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to the Lesser Bonapartes, the history podcast that is exploring history and your world. I am Glenn, and with me as always is Kristaps.
Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Eastern Border. No, you didn't mishear that. This is a shared show, actually. As some of you might know, I got my hands on some very interesting Soviet textbooks about history and everything. And you know what? It is September. And by the time you're listening to this, you know that I have already been married. So I thought, it's September, let's look at education in the Soviet era. And while I was reading those books, I was thinking, oh yeah, it's going to be so great on the Eastern Border that I'm reading this, and I'm looking at more stories from this, and I understand that, this is just so hilarious that it would make a perfect Lesser Bonapartes episode as well. And then I spent some time wondering, Eastern Border, Lesser Bonapartes, Eastern Border, Lesser Bonapartes. And then it struck me, both. So, yeah, we'll try to take a look at, and Glenn here will ask some important questions, which I'll try to answer as, Glenn, I hope you will make sure that, make sure that what I'm saying is interesting, because I don't know what you Americans might need to know about the craziness that is Soviet schools and universities and everything that's going on there.
We don't really get a whole lot of information. Like, even when I was growing up as a kid, there wasn't, like, a whole lot. And I guess, as kind of preface this whole episode, we're taking it a little easy this couple of weeks. Just the weeks where Kristaps is getting married and everything. It's a big change. We're just kicking back and having fun. So we're really turning the chairs backwards on this one, and we're just going to rap. We're going to rap about Soviet history for a while and really get on your level, the kids, and tell you all about that. And when I was a kid, I grew up during kind of the late days of the Cold War in the 80s. And all we really heard about from the Soviet Union was, like the general things like, oh, they wait in line for 6 hours for one pair of Levi's. Nuclear war is going to destroy us all. Rocky IV kind of stuff, and there wasn't really a whole lot of the nuance and like the history. And what really fascinates me is you never really heard what, say, like the Soviet history, what you were learning in the Soviet Union or what you thought about America, or what even the story of America was being told at the time. I'm sure there was a lot of, decadent capitalism type stuff, but I don't know what exactly you thought of your own history. We never got any of that in America. So I guess there's just a lot of ignorance. I think that's why your show, The Eastern Border, has caught on so much, is that people are listening to it and going, huh, okay, because we never saw it from that point of view. And especially anybody growing up in the Soviet Union during, the high point. And what year exactly are these books from? Are they from the 50s or the 60s?
Actually, they're from various ages. Here's one, which is USSR History Christianity, which is from 77th. Then I have Riga at the Age of Socialism, which is it's also from 70s. Then I have a university textbook from 86, which is the beginning of Perestroika. And then I have another one from the 50s. Yeah. I sadly, I don't have anything from the 60s on me right now, but yeah, 50s, 70s, and there are vast differences between the books too, because the one written in 50 is still, Stalin's era, and then we can switch on to stagnation, and then there's Glasnost, and it's like living in separate worlds, even in Soviet textbooks. The truth about what was going on in the world and the Soviet Union had, let's just say, it shifts around really, really fast, and it's a bit crazy. And just to start this off about America, You'll be surprised because the book in the 50s is very, very nasty and mean about the imperialistic Americans. While that one in the Glasnost, it's like, yeah, we can live together with them. They're bad and they're capitalists, but we seek peace and everything is nice. While the one in the 50s actively says that no, you're all evil and it's only a matter of time until we crush you. Also, some sort of weird changes going on there.
So what age of student would this be taught to? Like what?
Okay,
what
I have
group?
3 books for high school from history and 1 university book. That Riga at the Age of Socialism is a university level book. Because that's economics and about how Riga. Basically, this one is advanced history because that's specifically looking at the social and political status of Riga, 1917 to 1975, and that's kind of university level, but everything else is high school level books there that I have acquired. Those are just amazing. But I have some troubles with starting somewhere because when you cover 4 history books plus a lot of stories, because as usual I went around and my normal thing, hey, I need to do something about Soviet history and about schools, better call up my dad and his friends and all other people, so I have some stories and jokes from personal experience as well, not just these factual history books. But yeah, Glenn, I don't know where to start. Where should I start? Give me a hint.
I guess the most logical place to start would be the October Revolution, and how that is told vis-a-vis, like, say, what was going on in World War I, and how the books, say, in the 1950s would have viewed kind of the final days of the Tsar. Do they look back on that nostalgically? Do they go like, oh, there's the Tsar was so great, the Romanov dynasty was so great, and then they went away? Or is it like, the decadent monarchy fell and the Soviet Revolution was much better? Like, how do they view I guess you could say the imperial czarist days as opposed to, say, the communist days?
Oh, it's dreadful, evil, and very, very oppressive. And that's constant all the time. Tsar was never, never, ever good. Now, strangely enough, I was looking through this, and weirdly enough, for example, Gavrilo Princip is just mentioned as the victim of Austro-Hungarian oppression on all this time. It's said that the war started because of the Austro-Hungarian imperialistic ambitions. And through the various... Basically, World War I is explained as inevitable. Like, the inevitable clash of the old-school bourgeoisie and colonial empires that led to destruction of that world, and through which the socialist world arose. In the same vein, World War II is looked at as how the fascists and capitalists wanted to destroy the newfound wealth of the Soviet Union and stop us becoming great, and like... The First World War is a natural extension of all these old monarchies and oppressive bourgeoisie and everything. That's just the logical conclusion of that age to Soviets. It's perfectly normal and natural. And of course they lament that, oh no, so many people died, but they also admit that, yes, it was actually, it would have happened eventually, essentially, and that was the big catalyst that drove people to understand and drove people to the Soviet Revolution. They view it that way. And then, yeah, World War II, that again is a response to, and it's actually a plot by capitalists to destroy the Soviets, and another attempt for imperialists to regain power, essentially. There's not that much about individual personalities in this. These old books, they just say Tsar regime was oppressive and everything, but they don't view it as individual people making individual things, really. Some individual heroic tales are, of course, told about valiant, revolutionary Lenin and all that stuff, but it's trends and forces, completely trends and forces. They, I guess they might agree with you, but they take it to the utter extreme, stating that basically the only thing going on is trends and forces as per dialectic scientific Marxism. They say that individuals have zero impact on anything, and that therefore, everything can be reducible to these trends and forces, and according to Marxism, everything can be predicted, and rise of socialism and its global victory is, of course, completely natural and will 100% happen, because history is just like maths. You just have to look the right way.
I guess I want to go back a little bit to the World War I then, because So is the whole World War One versus say Austria-Hungary? Is that because of a certain jealousy? Because Russia has always thought the Balkans belong to them, kind of thing. Does that always come back in all the histories from World War One until all the way up until the end?
See, also they blame Tsar for Tsar's own imperialistic ambitions of acquiring these territories in the Balkans as the reason why Tsar was willing to throw millions of people to the grinding stone and to just lose a bunch of people just for a blatant land grab. They don't like the Tsar at all, and they say, "Oh, it was just Tsar's ambition and this," and Tsar was oppressing people to do this to fuel his war machine and all that stuff. First World War rapidly shifts into revolution period. It's basically Soviet era. These books, they basically focus on what Lenin was doing in specific times, how he was working this, and there is not much written about the Western Front. You don't really learn anything about what was going on the Western Front. You just learn that in the end, basically the whole focus on First World War is that look at what the evil imperialists are doing, look at how many people died, so now the really important part that happened because of the war is our glorious revolution, obviously.
Okay, so
and they're sort of happy that, for example, actually, interestingly enough, in the 50s, like the late Glasnost history book, when it comes to the First World War, it at least shows some compassion and like says it's kind of it's bad that so many people died. Look what the evil capitalists did there, but it's kind of sad that so many people died. But the 50s book is like, look at how the capitalist economy. Their focus was more like how the capitalist economies have suffered. It almost pushed all the world to socialist revolution, but evil capitalists just essentially why the world didn't turn socialist immediately. At the same time Russia did was just because your evil oppressive capitalists after the First World War must have oppressed the communist parties everywhere and must have done some mass extermination, which is now being hushed and done in secret, but it must have happened.
So is the Eastern Front kind of seen as this great Russian victory because of, Austria-Hungary just basically died from general winter on the Eastern Front? So is that seen as like a military victory, or say a victory against, the oppressive Austria-Hungarian regime? Or
see, it's weird. It's seen as, look, the Tsar is looked upon as betraying his own people for getting into the war in the first place and having these imperialistic ambitions.
Okay.
At the same time, the fact that revolution happened is kind of looked at on the other side because, but that finally allowed us to do the revolution and liberate the people from the evil Tsar and curb the excesses of the nobility, give true freedom to the people. It's kind of dualistic. They hate the Tsar for starting the war, but they like that the war started because then they could do that revolution.
Oh, okay. So I guess instead of, I thought I was going to start at the October Revolution and go forward, but I actually feel like going backwards. Then you mentioned Marxism and things like that. How around World War One, we did this, and I don't know if you heard our Carlin on the Luddite Revolt.
Actually, I haven't listened to all the Carlins yet. I regularly forget to do that.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. But the Carlin we did on the Luddite was pretty interesting because after the whole Luddite revolt, you had kind of an extension of the Luddite revolt, which was anarchism in the early 20th century, and anarchists hated Marxism. Kind of going back to the Luddite ideas that Marxism put all the value on the machines and who owned the machines and who owned the means of production rather than putting the value on the people, the skilled workers themselves. So when we talk about Marxism, how we view Marxism as, say, Russia itself became more, was nominally communist, became more capitalistic as it went on. Does the view toward the original ideals of Marxism change with the decades in those textbooks, or is it always pretty much the same party?
No? Of course not. What are you? What do you think we're gonna betray? The Marx-Lenin thing? Marx and Lenin are always put together, and even Gorbachev in his Perestroika books says that, we are actually not becoming more capitalistic. It's a common mistake. He states that what he's doing in the Perestroika is returning back to the true interpretations of Marx and Lenin, that those true interpretations had been corrupted. Marx and Lenin is always there, especially Lenin. Lenin gets deified. Marx is like the precursor, but his studies, but he's being like taught in every school, every university forever. And a quick side note, those were often the most boring lectures ever, and it might sound like a joke, but at that time you had to go to your classes in university like wearing a suit or something. But people tended to just basically, and those lectures were mandatory even if you went to our like College of Arts or the musical higher education facility or whatever. If you were studying to become a doctor, every possible profession that you could, like education that you could get in the college, involved these Marxism classes, scientific Marxism. You couldn't pass, and you couldn't become, like, for example, a professional, say, bass player, from that conservatorium thing if you didn't really got your good grades on Marx-Lenin classes. And that's kind of interesting because one of my dad's colleagues from there, if you want to become a professional choreographer for ballet, you also had to finish these Marxism-Leninism classes. And one of my dad's friends, who ended up being quite a great choreographer for our ballet, his family wasn't very politically kind of, let's just say, you only could get into university if you had somewhat of a clean slate, because you had these exams and everything. But if you, went to some protests and the people in the university understood that you're not exactly very friendly to the regime, and you're like openly not very friendly to the regime, they would do everything they can to throw you out of the university. And, sometimes legally, but sometimes less legally, but, to keep up appearances, they had to find a valid, good reason why they would kick you out. So the story goes like this. This choreographer dude, he has his final exams before he would get his diploma and everything, like final exam session. But he's just been informed that they are going to throw him out and everything, and he has also some humanitarian subjects. That's the teacher's position as well. So he manages to pass off some subjects. He's given extra hard versions of the exam. He manages to pass them, but he still has to write an essay in this Marxism-Leninism class. Like scientific Marxism class at the end requires you to write an essay. And everyone just knows that, no, he's gonna get a 1 in that one, because back then, schools, all the grades were rated from 1 to 5, 5 being the best one, 1 being when you fail. 1 and 2 is you fail, 3, 4, 5 is acceptable. So, everyone knows that dude's gonna fail. He's going to the exam for this reason, very, very drunk, and mega pissed off, because, he just wants to finish the damn university. But then he has to write this essay, and the theme of the essay is, would you explain what your ideal is in life, and what will you do after you finish this university to become like him? And basically an essay explaining you grab something which you want to idolize, and you kind of, what will you do to make this country better? Blah, blah, blah. It's bullshit political nonsense, okay? So, and he sits there and he knows that whatever he writes, he's gonna get like a failed grade, and that's gonna be published, and he won't finish. But he did, because he sat down there for half an hour, wrote a single sentence on that piece of paper, then handed in the essay, and he was given a 3, and he passed because those people up there, they could have gotten, because all of these essays were collected and looked at by the political officers, and if they would have given bad grades for this essay, they would have got into trouble themselves, because the one sentence he wrote was, "There is no man on planet Earth that I admire and want to be like more than our great leader, Leonid Brezhnev." And no explanations, no nothing. Basically, he had to write nothing that could look even remotely suspicious. And, as Brezhnev was leader at the time, it would look terribly, terribly bad if he would then, get a bad grade and went with this essay of one sentence to higher-ups and different political offices, because everyone had enemies back then in the apparatchiks bureaucracy. So, yeah, they had to give him a 3 so he could become a choreographer.
That's funny. That's interesting that you mentioned that was so boring. It's never talked about, and it was never. I don't know if the situation's changed. It probably hasn't, because I was still kind of at the tail end of old history books, kind of just taught American exceptionalism. George Washington could never tell a lie. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and everything was wonderful. We defeated Hitler in World War II, and nothing bad ever happened, and we never did anything bad. So it was kind of like that. And I remember one time, during a school book fair, and actually what got me interested in all of this is I during a school book fair where they were just clearing out some old books from the high school library. I got it for
Ow.
$1.
I'm sorry. Ow, ow, ow. I moved on my chair. I can't move my legs today. I'm sorry. Carry on, Glenn. Sorry.
Okay, I saw a book. I actually saw the Communist Manifesto, and I bought it for $1. And this was in high school, and I read it, and it really kind of blew my mind because it was all a bunch of stuff that sounded pretty reasonable, and I didn't understand how anybody American could object to it, because you grew up in America thinking, communism is evil, communism's horrible, communism is just eating boiled potatoes every day, and sitting around trash can fires at night, and then I read this book and I thought, wow, how could anybody that has a job basically object to what this book is saying? I didn't understand at all. Like how could the average person say these were all bad ideas? I mean, maybe some of them are, less realistic than others, but how could you completely dismiss it outright? And we had an assignment in a socialism class, I remember that year. And the assignment was, I had a real kind of a hippy dippy teacher, and his assignment was, you have to come up in front of the class and teach something. You can teach anything you want. Just teach something for an hour. That's your assignment. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll be really impressive and teach the tenets of communism vis-a-vis the Communist Manifesto. And everyone got really mad at me when I was up there teaching the people responded hostily. Even the teacher was kind of thinking that I was just intentionally trying to be a troublemaker by getting up and trying to explain why property was theft or something like that, and people got really mad because it just seems so antithetical to everything we learned in American history. So that's interesting to learn that even in Russia, you weren't that thrilled about having to learn about these. I guess because it just got shoved down your throat so much.
You had to learn about it everywhere. All the time, everything on these history books. Yeah, and that's giving me a nice subject. Every part of these history books is just filled with why communism is great, how all of this works into to Marxism. And interestingly enough, even in the books in the 80s, unless it's purely about Riga, which ends in 75, all these other history books, they end at the end of World War II. Done. Even in the 80s, there was nothing in the books about what happens in the 60s. No mention of current politics whatsoever, at all.
Oh, that's funny, because you think they would want to mention all the space race stuff, but that's not in the history books at all?
No. Just this Riga and the Age of Socialism, that's more of economics book, really, but all these history books end at the end of World War II. And it's strange, really, and it's peppered. And this one I have from what is it, 77? Yeah, it's basically about the history of Latvian SSR essentially, and it just goes through starting with Tacitus. Basically, it starts with Tacitus and doing something with that, and the chapter titles are it never says Latvian territory, it never says Baltics. It just says in the territory of Latvian SSR. Everything is Latvian SSR, and their chapter names are, for example, Baltic Crusade is the chapter about Baltic Crusade is instead named the fight and struggle against the aggression of German feudalists. This or Latvian people under the yoke of German feudalists. The chapter after that. And the next part is interestingly called, and all this time, every tiniest sliver, rumor, and everything that all the time that we here in the Baltics, in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have actually been very closely tied to the Russians, and that Russians have taught us culture, and that Russians were always the good guys, and that we are actually almost the same people, and that Russians are very, very good, and that they're crucial to our existence. That's peppered there completely. For example, another chapter is called Livonia, during the time of the creation of Russian centralized state. I mean, they define the time period, this time period of early 16th century, as basically the time of creation of a unified Russia. They define everything through this. because it's all peppered there, because it states how we actually always wanted to join Russia. It was good. Russians have always been there. They have done everything, and actually Russians from Pskov really wanted to help us during the Baltic Crusade, but the Germans oppressed them because they're evil. Bonus points if you have listened to our Northern Crusade episode, which was also on both feeds, then you might have noticed that the Russians really didn't have any impact whatsoever during these crusades here. They were too busy fighting their own troubles, you know.
Well, yeah, I think the only involvement you could say the Russians really had would have been like the whole Alexander Nevsky era in Novgorod. But more than that, they didn't. It's not like they didn't really help in the stopping of the Teutonic Knights. Really, that was all Poland, Lithuania.
But that's another subject. Even though the Soviet Union always said that they were very international, this whole Russian centrism there, that's very, 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 very hard and throw-felt there. It's amazing. Basically, interestingly enough, the Russians apparently, according to the Soviets, have invented everything. It wasn't Edison that invented the light bulb. It was some Russian who kind of did, he experimented with that. So actually, he's the first one who did it. And it goes. Well,
was it Nikolai Tesla? What was he?
No, that's not Tesla. That's another dude. That's another dude whose name I cannot find there. It's just I know there was. Interestingly enough, it actually says in the early 20th century history that brothers Wright actually didn't invent the airplanes. It was a certain Russian named Mazulsky. And there's interesting enough about the fact that how they go to great lengths about explaining what experiments this Mazulsky did with aeronautics and everything, and how he actually did it before the brothers Roger Wilbur Wright and stuff, and how he actually is responsible for modern airplanes and everything. And I thought, I'm looking at this and I'm like, I haven't heard of this guy. What's the deal here? So I googled this one up, and you know what? Mazulsky really did invent the airplane, but what's the problem there? It didn't fly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's been experiments with flight going all the way back, but I guess, kind of the Orville and Wilbur Wright thing is just more like to the point of like American exceptionalism.
No. Actually, no, man. The thing is, this Mazulsky dude, he really, really, really wanted to make a machine that could be heavier than air and still fly. And he tried his best to do it. Except he failed and it never took off. If you invent an airplane that never flies and cannot fly, and you never succeed at that, then you really can't be called the inventor of an airplane, I think. I mean... Yeah,
I guess it at least has to fly before I guess to say you really succeeded in inventing the airplane. But yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. I didn't know, but I'll have to do some more reading, or I'll have to pick up on that. But I guess so more toward back where we're going. So in the years between World War I and World War II, when kind of the Soviet politics was really kind of cementing itself, what does it say about, say, like I guess I'll say the rivalry between, say, like Stalin and Trotsky, who wanted to keep the glorious revolution going and spread it to all countries, and Stalin, who was more of a military dictator. Does Stalin come out as the good guy because of World War II, or is Trotsky kind of demonized, or does it even get mentioned at all?
You see, this is where we're at now at the show too, in a sense, because Stalin is, of course, the glorious hero of everything in the 50 history book, 1950, written while he was alive. But after the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, where Khrushchev gained power just after Stalin's death, Stalin was demonized then. And after that, Stalin is said to basically... Stalin overdid this. Stalin made a personality cult. He had nice ideas, but he was terrible, terrible, terrible man. And no. He was responsible for mass murders, and he wasn't good, and he corrupted the communist ideals. Because you know what, to legitimize your own power, Khrushchev had to put Stalin down, and all these things. Because Stalin had managed to piss off a bunch of, Schema had managed to piss off all the other power elites by shooting everyone and making everyone very threatened. Trotsky, however, is always demonized, but the problem is, he's not really even mentioned that much. Like I said, all these things, Mensheviks, which he led, are mentioned, but it's like, yeah, but those guys were easily crushed. Trotsky turned out to be a traitor and ran away. Died in exile. Done.
Wow. Yeah, it's. I guess you'd have to kind of sweep him under the rug. Yeah.
Basically, they sweep everything under the rug. They don't really delve into this. Trotsky just swept under the rug, and nothing really is happening, except that during these interwar periods, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, we were all independent. So was the Czechoslovakia, and a bunch of countries. And they write about this period here, stating that it's in this book, for example, it says capitalistic Latvia under the bourgeoisie, under the tyranny of bourgeoisie. They of course say that we had our own small civil war going on here because there were some communists here at that time, and I'll get to the October Revolution in the show. It's really interesting because at one point Latvia had 3 governments at the same time, which is weird. Yeah, but basically it says how actually the communist government is the really legitimate one, and how all these nationalistic bourgeoisie capitalists were really just setting up their nationalistic government, even though obviously all the working men wanted to join the Soviet Union. Yes, and things like that, and how everything was terrible and dreadful, and they glorify a bunch of Soviet dissidents and who happen to be alive there. They try to find, like, for example, whole chapter in this history book is dedicated to a guy who managed to basically save an underground printing press by stealing this small single printing press and grab it to his apartment, where he kept it for a week before sending it to the Soviet Union. You have a chapter dedicated to just this guy who saved one printing press.
Oh.
They try to stick, because Soviet power and all the communists weren't popular in Latvia during the 20s and 30s, well, for quite obvious reasons, because we looked to our big neighbor, the Soviet Union next door, and we were like, no, guys. So, yeah, and they try to paint that period as completely oppressive and terrible, and try to paint it as though, people always wanted to be in the Soviet Union. What really struck me, interestingly enough, about this period is that, the Soviets apparently were so afraid of any nationalism and any nationalistic symbols whatsoever that not only the flags and like the heraldry and some national symbols of Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia from that time period, they're not only shown in any photographs, they're not even mentioned. They just don't mention even how interwar Latvia, which is our current flag of Latvia, how it even looked like, which is kind of interesting.
I have a question about that, because I didn't know that, say, like Latvia, Estonia, and, Lithuania, they had independence in the interwar period. So was there ever a chance that these Baltic countries may have gone over to another side, maybe have joined Germany, or, say, joined Sweden? Or was there ever a chance where they might have been lured away before they got absorbed by the Soviet Union?
Oh, boy. Oh, short history of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Very short about that time, extremely short. Basically, Russia has its revolution, and Latvia and a bunch of countries decide to grab their own independence and set up their own governments here. In 1918, 18th of November, Latvia declares that, hey, we're our own separate country. At the same time, there is a Soviet-made government who says, no, you're Latvian SSR, somewhere there in Daugavpils, which is basically parts from the Russian army, led by Lenin and supported by some locals who say, no, let's just grab them back into the Soviet Union. At the same time, the remnants of the German army, which are still here, want to create their own sort of German-run state, which would make Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as essentially vassals of Germany, and kind of essentially all German monarchists trying to seize some territory as their base of power so that they could plan for the future. That happens in 1918. Later, there were some plans about some Baltic Federation forming, maybe, but it went really nowhere. But yeah, Soviets came here first in 1940, and then Hitler invaded. Essentially, the idea was that Stalin came here first, annexed us, just like he did in Crimea, like with a completely free and honest referendum where 99.9% vote yes, with tanks on the street and armed soldiers everywhere. You know, with every other party except the Communist Party forbidden. Nice elections there, really. So then, and then the big purges started here, and a lot of, like, essentially about 40% of people living here ended up being sent to gulags or Siberia, just die and stuff. And after this, Hitler came here and treated us as demi-human. Not quite human, but not as bad as Stalin did. So, it's a dodgy subject. I want to touch it way later, because it's so complicated that I don't even want to get into this. This is just about Soviet education, really.
Then,
but yeah, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, we used to be independent from 1918 to 1940 for 22 years.
Wow. So, okay, so there was, oh, that's interesting. I guess that would have been the battleground you were really fought over. That was pretty much the Eastern Front. And then I guess it was pretty bad. Especially during World War II. And so I guess I sort of had my... so is World War II painted as this kind of battle between, say... Because, I mean, America wasn't really an antagonist to Russia yet, so is it seen as this sort of war between the ideals of communism and fascism? Or is it seen... Because you were saying, like, there was talk about, America's imperialistic...
This is very weird, because... Okay... For starters, it's not called World War II in Russia, and even modern-day Russia. It's called the Great Patriotic War, because World War II starts in 1939. Great Patriotic War starts in 1941, because Soviet Union does not participate in World War II from the very beginning, because they were allied with Hitler at that point, and they had this non-aggression pact. See, interestingly, when it mentions World War II, basically Soviet Union says that we needed to protect ourselves from the evil capitalists abroad, but we were a very peaceful country, and we trusted Hitler, because, even though he was a terrible, terrible monster, we gave him a chance, and he backstabbed us and was a terrible, terrible monster. Oh, what a surprise there, you guys. But the idea is that this non-aggression pact and Molotov-Ribbentrop pact is portrayed as Soviets being kind and nice and peace-loving dudes in the quotation. Like, we're just gonna give him a chance. I mean, the evil capitalists say he's bad, and we don't like the evil capitalists too, but we know that he's a terrible evil monster. But you can never know. It's basically they try to reason their way out of why they were allied at the beginning. And here comes the weirdest part. I mean, in September 1939, when Soviet Union is still allied with Hitler and how the First World War starts, is that Hitler invades Poland. That starts the Second World War, right? But at the same time, just I guess a few days later, Soviet Union also invades Poland from the other side, which is kind of interesting because they even held a victory parade together between their occupation lines, which people tend to forget, and it is also now legal to say that in Russia. But yeah, that happened, and you should really look that one up, because it's very scary how Soviet generals and Nazi generals are just marching in occupied Poland together. So those guys didn't like anyone. But the Soviet side justified their joint invasion of Poland, which it actually was, as essentially trying to liberate Ruthenians, Belarusians, and Western Ukrainians from the dominance and the oppression of the evil Polish nobility, Szlachta, which were still ruling there and were oppressing them. So when Hitler was invading, they were trying to save those people and the Polish people from their own nobility and their terrible, terrible oppression. That is why they needed to be invaded by the Soviet Union and made Soviet. Obviously.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, because that's an interesting take on that, because I mean, it's only recently become accepted in America that when Hitler first came into power in the 1930s, he was admired by a lot of politicians and leaders of industry in America, actually, who heralded him as this kind of hero of Germany after World War I, and when he opened the Autobahn and things like that, people just thought that was brilliant. kind of trains ran on time type thinking. So I guess I could see where at first you kind of wanted to be on his team before it all went off the rails and he invaded Russia and things like that.
No, but see, one of the interesting theories is that what I have heard is that Stalin was very happy about Hitler being in power. For example, Hitler didn't actually outright win the elections. He won the elections outright, but during that time there was a great chance that social democrats and locals, like hardcore socialists, were funded by the Soviet Union at the time. And both of these parties knew that if they don't work together and don't run as a united bloc, then Hitler would win. So socialists wanted to make a joint list with the social democrats running together and thus winning these elections when Hitler came to power. Interestingly, Stalin, he had sent messages to these socialists explicitly forbidding socialists to do just that, and giving them money and threatening to cut off their money if they even think about making a joint list with social democrats. Now think about it, Stalin could have just prevented Hitler from ever having power. Oh yeah, and at the same time he basically invited, Germany had to be demilitarized at the time, and Soviet Union for a while needed a lot of gold, so they took Germany's gold and trained German guys, German officers, in their own assault schools. I mean, really, a lot of German air commanders had learned how to operate their planes and air wings in Soviet kind of airfields.
Weren't you? I think you mentioned before, telling me too, that the Soviet Union allowed the German army to perform kind of war games too, and they're kind of secretly within Soviet territory, right? Weren't you? I think. Yeah. There are also documents on that,
but we're derailing this to very hardcore territory. I just want to talk about education more. This was really, really fun.
Why not? That's a.
Yeah, but it's all about it's all about the political aspect, really, and at the same time, modern politics never mentioned. They don't mention modern, after World War II, it all dries up. There is no history after World War II. And previous history is all about this Russian exceptionalism, essentially. And this whole how everything naturally turns into socialism and how everything works that way. And it's kind of really scary if you think about it. And a lot of people just tended to skip all these classes. Collectivism also plays a huge role in this. Like I mentioned in my childhood episode, all these textbooks and everything are just geared to show how individuals alone can do nothing, how collectivism is important, how everyone should be raised in the communist morale, as they always tend to really downplay any significant role by a single individual. Interestingly enough, by the way, Russians apparently really loved the French Revolution. It's weird, because they see it as the precursor to their own revolution. Basically, French Revolution is, it breaks down feudalism and turns it into this modern bourgeoisie capitalism, of which the next step would logically then be the global communism revolution. So they kind of don't approve of the capitalism at all, but they look at the Jacobins as their heroes. They look at Jacobins as people who were progressively thinking and they were advancing history in the right direction. I mean, they would be considered scum by socialism standards because they were not socialistic enough and they didn't follow Marx, who wasn't born at the time, obviously, but they were, in general, they were very progressive for their times, they were excellent dudes and everything. And explicitly, no mentions of Great Terror. Practically none. What is said about Great Terror and there about Robespierre and his head choppings is that, of course, like in every other revolution, some enemies and counter-revolutionaries who were clinging to the past and were deemed a very dire threat to the existence of the state were eliminated and dealt with. But yeah, there is no mention of mass terrors, drownings, massive use of guillotine, nothing like that. And Napoleon himself, by the way, is seen as some sort of logical conclusion to this bourgeoisie revolution, even though it's progressive, it could not have ended well because it was still a bourgeoisie revolution. Even though it's progressive, they're still bad. So Napoleon kind of ends the revolution, corrupts it, takes it to its logical conclusion and uses it to fuel his own imperialistic ambitions. And brings law to people, and it's kind of, he can't stop the progress from happening, but he kind of twists and abuses this progress. And my theory, personally, and I spoke with people about this, is that they don't mention the Large Terror, because that would, at least for the smarter side of the population, would kind of, it would have some serious implications if you would really talk about the terror and French Revolution, and then you remember that while reading Lenin's combined works, which also is a mandatory reading, you understand that there's so many mentions of terror there, even by Lenin already, that it's kind of insane.
I can imagine. So I guess what I think my takeaway so far from this is it's really fascinating to me, and maybe even kind of confusing to me, that the Russian history books would stop at World War II, because immediately after World War II, two very important things come along. That's Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro. These would seem to be great victories for the Russian government communistic ideals, but they don't talk about the People's Republic of China and the Cuban Revolution at all.
Oh, no, there are different books about Cuba, but it's not just taught at school. It's like geography classes, maybe, yes, but not in history. History ends there. They didn't touch modern politics. They didn't want people to get very interested in modern politics, you see. And about Mao, well, he was Stalinist for starters. He was very, very Stalinist. And Khrushchev was a KGB man, not a Stalinist man. In the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, when Khrushchev gets power, he denounces Stalin a lot. He says that, no, this personality cult can't go on, we must reform our country a bit, we will live on differently from now on, stuff like that. Just to legitimize him and, make sure that people don't hate him as much. Even though he's just as violent, he's doing it a bit differently, so to speak. But you see, Mao, he wasn't on board with this denouncing Stalin at one point, because he was still very much alive and kicking when Stalin died. And he was like, wait a minute, I'm operating like Stalin, I like Stalin, I operated the same way, what's going on with you guys? So he basically thought that Khrushchev and everyone else had gone off from the right, straight path set by Stalin, so he stuck around, and obviously Khrushchev later couldn't support Mao either, so he started, because essentially Mao thought that by denouncing Stalin, they denounced him by proxy as well. And at one point they kind of did, because they weren't happy with the direction China was going with their still cult of personality and all this Maoism. So China, after Stalin's death, turns into a rival, essentially. So not very friendly relationships with them, not many mentions.
So I think I'm starting to understand here. They didn't want people getting too involved in the modern political situation because they wanted to be able to control the narrative, right? They wanted to be able to control what was being said about what was happening, and they didn't want people being too aware of the rest of the world, I guess, because that would undermine their ability to control what people heard.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, the only thing, like I've mentioned also before, was that also in the news, for one, there were like only good news made the news. Like, Soviets built a new road, Soviets did this, Soviets did that. Some of that was terribly exaggerated, of course, but no bad news, no criticism, nothing. Just the good stuff. The narrative was extremely controlled. But yeah, I don't know. And this information control, like I said, it was difficult to get into university. Because, well, those people whose families were, like, really considered unfriendly to the nation, those guys were just put aside and never looked at. And like I said, my grandmother only made it to the medical school because her dad was a Lutheran preacher. She only made it to the medical school because she finished high school with a gold medal. Essentially, she had like all 5s. 1-4 in scientific Marxism because she really hated scientific Marxism like everyone else. But she only made it to the university because of her grades, and they just couldn't throw her out without repercussions from above. But yeah, there was this nice political joke about getting university and all the Soviet education. It's like back then, like right now, you get into university with your centralized exam grades, which you get when you end high school. Back then, you had to take another separate exam to get into university. And there was this joke about a brand new student trying to get into the Faculty of History. An attempt to get into the Faculty of History with huge corruption, like the system of Blatnoy, these... With essentially, a student is trying to get into the history faculty with gigantic, enormous connections and with the right people and everything. His exam, he goes to the examiner, takes up one of the tickets, with random tickets with a question, and is asked, Is it true that World War II happened from 1939 to 1945? Well, yes. Great, you're in. Now, another student comes in, and he's like, not so well connected. He has paid some money, his family has arranged some things, such as given deficit products and arranged a pair of Levi's for the professor, but they're not that good. Just not good. Connection's not as good. So he pulls out his ticket, and his question is like, name the years in which the World War II lasted. He says 1939 to 1945. And he gets a second question. Yeah, and how many people did the Soviet Union lose in World War II? And he responds, 20 million. Great, you're in. And now finally the third, your average student comes in and passing this exam. He doesn't, like, without connections, standard try, so to speak. First question, years of the World War II. Second question, how many people died? He answers both of them. And then the third question comes. Great. And now name all of those people.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. That's pretty.
It wasn't as bad, but yeah, and this at one point. But if you got in, it was extremely hard to like get out of there. And well, unless you failed your grades, which was kind of a bit hard to do all of this. And yeah, but then again, some teachers were under some professors and everything. The teachers were also hard pressed to study all of this because, you know, some of the students could have been like agents sent in by the KGB to look at if you're teaching everything the right way. They had to write accounts, and they, you know, all the books and everything they had to write in this. Like, you have a textbook, for example, and we still use these textbooks because when it comes to philosophy, I mean, Plato translated to Latvian is still Plato translated to Latvian. It doesn't really, you know, age. It doesn't change the Plato. You can read Plato from the same book, and that's a good Latvian translation. So why would you use another book, right? I mean, I hope it makes sense that we still use Plato translations because they're made by the same people. But essentially, if you are a philosophy student and you need to read Plato, and you have this one book which is when you kind of the teachers need to translate it from Latin from Greek to Latvian, right? But to do so, they have to write a prologue to this book, which explains how Plato's writings, why would they be necessary, and how would they advance the socialist agenda. So, in my nice Plato translation of things, Plato's Theaetetus, the huge dialogue, and the prologue, it's written that we need to read Plato because then we can understand the very basis of how bourgeoisie ideology, how the capitalist ideology is built, and he kind of influenced Hegel later, which influenced Marx. So then you can see the basis of scientific Marxism. Basically, they pulled out bullshit from their ass. They had to pull out bullshit from their ass in every prologue, explaining how all of this pertains to communism in one way or another to get any foreign thing translated whatsoever.
So then it stands to reason to me that you wouldn't have heard too much American history back then. The justification would be that we need this to learn more about, say, the imperialistic enemy, the Americans, or whatever like that, capitalism.
Very, very, very vaguely. I mean, you heard the basics in these books. I mean, the American Revolution is mentioned, but it's mentioned in the sense that, again, it's kind of the precursor to the French Revolution, which is looked at in much more detail. It's said that, it was the capitalistic bourgeoisie who wanted to end the feudalism, and this marked the beginning of the end of feudalism. It doesn't really go into the battles that much. It's just mentioned in passing, like, I don't know, not even a whole chapter is dedicated to the American Revolution. There's just, and about the Civil War, well, it's not mentioned in the book in the 50s. Not mentioned in the book in the 70s, and in 1806 there is a mention of the Civil War in about 3 sentences, and like, oh yeah, and during that time, like, they talk about Russia, and it says basically, oh yeah, and in that time Americans had their Civil War because evil bastards wanted to keep slavery going. Poof.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess it doesn't pertain too much to what the situation in Russia was at the time, but I guess, yeah, that's interesting because, yeah, we just don't get any of that Russian history up until maybe a little bit on the fall, maybe a little bit on Perestroika, because I was kind of a Jim Henson's Perestroika baby, in that I was a kid around the time of Gorbachev, and everybody would just make the jokes about the birthmark on his forehead kind of a thing. You didn't really get too much into his policies. Or you had, say like the Reagan moments, with, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. So I guess the Berlin Wall isn't mentioned too much if the modern history isn't discussed either. So, I mean, how did people even learn about this stuff if nobody's talking about it?
Some is that. and like some is that and all these books and all the smuggled stuff and like, word of mouth mostly.
So you would just hear like a rumor that a wall was being built in Berlin. You wouldn't like actually...
No, you wouldn't hear a story in the news. Of course, it was explained to the people who lived in Berlin and East Germany, but, in Soviet Union, we didn't even know about the wall unless we kind of saw it and then we heard it and it trickled down to us. But the press didn't go out publicly stating that, we're building this huge wall there to protect us from evil capitalists. Nothing like that happened there in the Soviet Union. I'm pretty sure it happened in East Germany, but I'm not an expert on that region. Yeah, same thing. We actually, you'll be amazed, because I said this on Rumor Flies show, that no one really bothered to speak even much about the assassination of Kennedy, too. It was like, he's assassinated. Big deal.
So I would have thought that would have been a bigger deal because there's so much involved with like the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. Which I guess wasn't...
What missile crisis, Glenn?
That never happened, right? There was no Bay of Pigs.
No. Bay of Pigs happened.
Oh, because...
But what missile crisis?
Oh, yeah, but I guess Bay of Pigs did happen because the Americans lost that one, so you'd want to talk about the great victory in that one.
Yeah, like only positive, like nothing critical at all. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things which Gorbachev tried to do in his perestroika. He wanted to allow people to write kind of the truth, but you know what, when you hide what is actually going on in the world for almost 50 years, at least 50 years here in Latvia, or longer in proper Russia, well, you open the floodgates and then like after a good hard constipation, the shit just comes out flowing freely, man.
Yeah, I guess so. And then, I guess it would be pretty embarrassing too.
And that's an apt comparison.
Well, sure, because I mean, think about how embarrassing that would be to admit that you've been hiding all this stuff for 50 years. You'd look pretty bad. So I guess you'd still want to hide enough of it to not look like a complete asshole when you finally put it all out there. Yeah,
but at the same time in 1986, Gorbachev, how he handled the Chernobyl catastrophe, that just shows that they were still trying when they even actually really couldn't, like at all. This is kind of interesting because at those times, one of the weird things is that, and that's another story, was that when the computers kind of arrived at the first time, and very, very late 80s, 86, 87 over here, they were called electronic calculation machines here, by the way. The name computer never really got into wide use here, but at the beginning they weren't seen as that important. Everything was still analog for a long, long while, and at one point I suppose Soviets made a mistake of not focusing on that, and when they started to figure out that hey, those things might actually be very useful and like for other important things, then I suppose it was too late.
Yeah, I guess. It might have been useful for helping to regulate nuclear power devices. I didn't even know that about the computers. I would have thought that. Well, I mean, how could they all be analog? Like even like the missile systems were still analog by then?
Well, they had some micro schemes and everything, but that was for military use or something. I mean, when I'm talking about computers, for example, you had the Atari game system coming out. You had IBM PCs over there. Nothing like that happened. People just, didn't figure out what was going on and that computers could be used in everyday life at all. Some strictly military stuff, of course, was computerized, but it was expensive and, for example, universities didn't use computers. It was for the military. Because it wasn't seen as a necessity unless for strictly military reasons. Like, it was just, why would we use computers somewhere like that or something? And for example, the first computer that I ever used was a Macintosh SE model, it was one of those Macs and I got it in 1995 when I was 6. Well, I didn't get it. My stepfather had it. He worked in the newspaper at the time. That was one of those monstrosities which were like very, very tiny black and white screen. It was like completely utterly useless, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, those early computers weren't good for too much aside from like playing Dig Dug or Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego.
We had fucked up forms of piracy, man. We had amateurs, radio amateurs going around, and like Soviets decided to get on computers at the very, very, very end, just before the dissolution in 1991. In Russia, like they invented Tetris, right? So that was about the period where when the computers became somewhat popular because they adopted it very quickly. And there were these ZX Spectrum computers, and the Soviet rip-offs of those computers were really excellent because the Soviet Union had the tendency of basically whatever you capitalists had in America. Soviet government would spend no effort of making something like really, really, really good, much better than what you had. But the problem is they couldn't mass produce it. They could only make like electronic music had a rich history in Soviet Union because they invented basically the first electronic keyboard thingy. That's a Soviet thing, by the way, as far as I've noticed. And then they actually somewhat pioneered electronic music in some twisted form, which is kind of crazy. I got a message after someone listened actually to that episode that you and Daniel did about music, right? Mm-hmm. I figured out that, which I didn't know, is that Soviets had actually made some very experimental electronic music instruments, but very, very few number. And they are credited on making the very first electronic music instrument ever, which was essentially some sort of box with two antennas, and you then waved your hand around these antennas, and that produced this whooshy sound or something.
You mean the theremin?
Here. Yeah, that's a Soviet invention.
Oh yeah, Leo Theremin was actually the name. Yeah, that's that sound you get from like 1950s, flying saucer sounds, like woo kind of stuff. Yeah. Oh, that's cool. I didn't even know that.
But yeah, Soviet education consists of people being taught that everything is good and nice and kind, and please ignore the reality, and that you have to wait in line to get the sausage for 6 hours. As far as I get it, and how I spoke with the dad and his friends, was like they made history before Soviet era look actually way worse than it was, just to make the current era look nicer. And that's kind of strange if you think about it. Like, right now, a lot of people want to make these golden ages happen and stuff, but back then, no. Back then, you had to paint history, which is bloody and terrible already. You had to make it even more bloodier and terribler, because otherwise those people might start wondering, how is this better than it was back then?
Nice. That's cool. Yeah, but that's an interesting take on, I guess, the Soviet textbook. I just... there's so much more to delve into. We'll have to do a series on some of these interesting ideas that you've brought up today. But I think that's a good place. This is a good jumping off point for a lot of different episodes we could potentially do.
I guess I'll be definitely taking a more in-depth look in some of this stuff on Eastern Border and analyzing it a bit more. But yeah, I suppose this is a nice jump off point. Glenn, would you do the honors?
Well, I guess we
no.
I guess we could just say, like both of our Facebook pages, follow us on our Twitters, rate and review us on iTunes, do our Patreon, www.patreon.com/The Lesser Bonapartes, and you have a Patreon as well, right, Chris? What's the address for that one?
/The Eastern Border.
Nice,
in one word.
We got all that happening. So you could always find us on there, or write us in to lesserbonapartes@gmail.com or theeasternborder@gmail.com, and let us know how we're doing over there.
Please do let us know how we're doing, because we're trying to get better every time, all the time.
Yeah, we basically had to relearn how to do shows, and we started from scratch, and here we are now, and I'm glad that we're doing it. I'm glad we do these occasional crossover episodes as well, and we will see you again on our respective shows, Chris's Eastern Border and ours, our The Lesser Bonapartes. Until then.
Wait a minute. What's Lesser Bonaparte's next show going to be about?
Our deep dive. We're going to be doing our Gareth approved series on the Elamites.
Oh, yeah. Well, next on Eastern Border, by the way, I'm interviewing a Lithuanian Soviet historian. So I'm going to have an academical perspective from a different Soviet country. Because I've been talking from my Latvian perspective, but I'm getting a Lithuanian who's also an academical historian of the Soviet era. So that's going to be amazing too.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so we'll be doing that as well. And we'll be seeing you around then. And until then, we are the Eastern Border / the Lesser Bonapartes. I am Glenn, and with me as always is Kristaps, and with just by himself sometimes is Kristaps.
I think the proper word is the Greater Bolsheviks, comrade.
and we'll see you next time.
This podcast is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Visit darkmyths.org for more shows like this one. The darkness awaits. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Border. If you have any comments or specific details you'd like to know, you're welcome to leave it in the comment section on our site, theeasternborder.lv, and we'll rummage even to the western border to find you an answer. Like this podcast, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our RSS feed. Happiness is mandatory. Good reviews and donations feed the farmers of our kolkhos in the great motherland. The Eastern Border salutes you.